My name is Diane Reeves. I am 53 years old. I live on a 5-acre property at the eastern edge of the Pisgah National Forest in Haywood County, North Carolina, in a farmhouse my grandparents built in 1949. My family has been in this county since before the Civil War, and I have spent my entire life on this land and in this forest. And there is not a trail or a hollow or a ridge within 3 miles of my house that I do not know by heart. I am telling you this because what I found in my attic on the morning of September 7th, 2018, the morning after Hurricane Florence made its inland push through the western Carolina mountains, tearing apart the forest I had known all my life, requires you to understand that I am not a person who confuses things. I am a retired elementary school principal with 34 years of experience managing the ordinary and extraordinary crises of institutional life. I am a woman who has lived alone since my divorce in 2009, who keeps bees and grows vegetables, and has a working knowledge of every bird species that nests on this property. I am careful. I am observant. And I know the difference between something I imagined and something I found. I found a Bigfoot infant in my attic the morning after the storm. I want to say that again, clearly, before I describe anything else, because the clarity of the statement is what this entire account requires, not a raccoon, not a possum, not any of the ordinary wildlife that a storm of Florence's intensity displaces from the surrounding forest. A Bigfoot infant, approximately the size of a large human toddler, with a coat of reddish-brown hair that was wet and matted and trembling with cold, crouched in the far corner of my attic behind the water heater, making a sound that I heard from the bottom of the pull-down attic stairs before I climbed a single step. Its cries held a secret that I could not have articulated in the moment of hearing them, but that I understand fully now, 6 years later. Those cries were the sound of something that had been alone in the dark for a long time, in conditions it had not been prepared for, separated from everything that meant safety to it, and that had not yet given up hope that something capable of helping it might arrive. I arrived. I climbed the attic stairs, and everything I thought I understood about the forest I had lived beside for 50 years changed in the first 30 seconds of what I found at the top. September 6, 2018. Hurricane Florence had been downgraded to a tropical storm by the time it reached the western Carolina mountains. But downgraded is a relative term in terrain, where the ridges funnel and amplify wind, and where the soil, saturated by days of pre-storm rain, gives up its grip on tree roots with a reluctance measured in decades and then all at once. My county recorded sustained winds of 61 miles per hour and gusts to 78. The creek at the bottom of my property went from its normal 6-inch depth to a 12-foot wall of moving water within 4 hours. I had sheltered in my basement, as the emergency protocols for this area advise when wind events of this magnitude are forecast. I had my radio and my flashlight and the specific practiced calm of a woman who has lived in storm country all her life and knows that the basement is where you go, and patience is what you bring with you. I had put the chickens in the storm coop the previous afternoon and secured everything in the yard that could become a projectile and filled the bathtubs with water in case the pump went out, and done everything that decades of mountain storm experience had taught me to do. What I had not anticipated was what the storm had done to the northeast corner of my attic. A large red oak, 60 years old, perhaps more, One of the trees I had climbed as a child and that I had expected to outlive me had come down in the night. It had fallen at an angle that brought its upper canopy against the roof line of the farmhouse, and in the shearing of branches and roofing material that the canopy's impact had produced, it had opened a gap in the attic structure approximately 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall, in the corner of the roof line closest to the surviving old-growth stand that ran along the property's northern boundary. I discovered this gap at approximately 8:20 a.m. on September 7th, when I came up from the basement after the wind had fully died and began the post-storm assessment that every property owner in this county knows how to conduct. I saw the oak first. You couldn't miss it, lying across the yard with its root ball exposed. I saw the damage to the roof line from outside. I put on my boots and went to get the ladder to take a closer look, and on my way back from the equipment shed, I heard, drifting from the upper level of the farmhouse, a sound I could not initially classify. Not mechanical, not the sounds of structural settling that follow storm damage, not the sound of any animal I had documented on this property in 50 years of living on it. A crying, small, sustained, with the rhythmic quality of something that has been crying for a long time and has settled into the rhythm because the rhythm itself has become a form of endurance. I went inside. I went to the attic, pulled down stairs in the upstairs hallway. I put my hand on the cord. And then I stood there for a moment, not from fear exactly, more from the specific, heightened attention that my body produces when it has received information it does not yet know how to process. Something is up there. It is alive, it is small, and it is crying. I pulled the stairs down. I climbed. The attic of the 1949 farmhouse is not finished. It is full of the accumulated evidence of 4 generations of family, old furniture, boxes of photographs, my grandmother's sewing machine, my father's fishing gear, and it smells of cedar from the planks my grandfather used for the storage shelving along the south wall, and of the particular damp warmth of an enclosed space that has just had a significant portion of its weather sealing compromised by a fallen oak. The light was gray and limited. The gap in the northeast corner admitted the pale September morning light in a single slanted column, and the rest of the attic was in the dim, shadowed half-light of a space not meant for habitation. I had a flashlight. I swept it across the attic floor, checking first for structural damage, for ceiling joists that might have been compromised, for anything that would make remaining up here immediately dangerous. The light found the water heater in the far northeast corner, and behind it, visible as I moved the beam to cover the storm damage area more thoroughly, was a shape that my brain processed in 2 stages, separated by perhaps 2 seconds. First stage, something is behind the water heater. Second stage, that is not anything I have a category for. It was approximately 3 feet tall in its crouched position, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around itself, the specific self-protective ball that any small creature makes of itself when it is cold and frightened and has found the most protected space available and is waiting in it with everything it has. The hair was reddish-brown, darker where wet, with a texture I could see even in the flashlight beam as different from any animal coat I had encountered in 50 years of proximity to the wildlife of western North Carolina. Not fur in the sense of the fine, dense pelt of a mammal, something coarser and longer, with more individual strand definition, something closer to hair in the human sense of the word, If human hair grew in a density and a coverage pattern that no human child ever displayed, the face turned toward the flashlight, eyes caught the beam and reflected it back, not the flat green-yellow eye shine of a cat or a raccoon, but something warmer, amber-tinged, and within the reflected light, the unmistakable anatomical signal of a face set for forward-facing vision, for depth perception, for the kind of three-dimensional visual processing that you find in primates and in human beings and in things that look at the world the way people do. Its eyes, wide and terrified, held a silent plea for warmth and safety. I have written this down many times in the 6 years since that morning, and each time I write it, I am aware that it sounds like anthropomorphization, like the projection of human emotional content onto an expression I had no framework to interpret. I am writing it anyway because it is the accurate description of what I saw, and because I was not frightened, which is itself the most telling response I can offer as evidence. I was a 53-year-old woman alone in her attic, looking at something she had no category for, and what she felt overwhelmingly and immediately was not fear. She felt the specific, cellular pull of something, small and cold and frightened and alive, that needed help. I sat down cross-legged on the attic floor, set the flashlight down pointing toward the ceiling so that the light was ambient rather than directed, and I said, in the quiet, deliberate, non-threatening voice I had spent 34 years using with frightened children, "It's okay. The storm is over. You're safe." The crying, which had continued through my ascent of the stairs and through the first minute of my presence in the attic, slowed, and then, in the specific way that distressed infants sometimes shift, not into silence, but into the listening mode that precedes trust, it stopped. I am going to call her Fern. I gave her this name on the second day of her time with me, privately, in the way that names arrive when you have committed to caring for something, because the names of things matter, and because what I was doing for whatever period lay ahead of me required the kind of caring that needs a name. Getting Fern down from the attic took most of the morning, not because she fought me, she did not, and I want to describe this carefully, because it matters enormously to everything that followed. Her decision to allow my approach when it came was not the passivity of an exhausted creature with no remaining resources for resistance. It was a considered choice, made by a being with evident cognitive capacity, after an assessment that took time and was visible in the shifting quality of her attention as I slowly, over the course of 2 hours, reduced the distance between us to a point where physical contact became possible. I did not approach her directly. I sat on the attic floor, 4 feet from the water heater, and I waited. I talked quietly, continuously, not explaining anything in particular, but simply offering the specific reassurance of steady human voice and non-threatening presence. Every few minutes, I moved slightly closer, not toward her directly, but in a gradual, oblique, non-confrontational approach that I had used with frightened animals before, and that communicates, across species lines, I am not a threat and I am not going away. At approximately 10:45 a.m., 2.5 hours after I first climbed those stairs, she moved, not away from me, toward me, a single tentative shift from behind the water heater into the open attic space, with her eyes on my face throughout the movement, monitoring my response to her movement with the specific evaluative attention of a being deciding whether the next step was safe based on the evidence of this step. I did not move. I breathed slowly. I kept my hands visible and my posture open. She came forward another foot. Her hand, and I want to describe Fern's hands because they became, over the weeks that followed, one of the details I documented most carefully in my private journal, and because they tell a specific story about what she was. The hand was large relative to the body, with long fingers and a thumb offset in the manner of a grasping hand, a hand built for holding and climbing and manipulating. She extended it forward toward my knee, and the tips of her fingers made contact with the denim of my jeans. I put my hand down, palm up, open, beside her fingers. She looked at my hand. She looked at my face. She looked at my hand again. And then, with the specific, deliberate motion of a being making a decision rather than following an impulse, she placed her hand in mine. The way its tiny hand gripped my finger, it wasn't merely animalistic, it was a desperate plea for connection. I have read this type of description before in accounts of other remarkable animal encounters, and I have always read it as sentiment overcoming precision. What I experienced on the attic floor of my grandmother's farmhouse on September 7th, 2018, at approximately 11 in the morning, was a grip that was simultaneously stronger than I expected and gentler than it could have been, calibrated in the specific way of a being with fine motor control and the capacity for deliberate force modulation. She held my hand the way someone holds the hand of a stranger they have decided, against all prior inclination, to trust. I helped her down the attic stairs. She needed almost no assistance with the mechanics. Her coordination and physical capacity were extraordinary for her apparent age. But she held my hand through the descent, and that contact meant something to her, and I knew it, and I held on. The practical challenges of the first 48 hours were significant, and I want to describe them honestly, because they ground the rest of this account in the specific reality of what caring for something you have no preparation for actually requires. I did not know what she ate. I did not know how much she slept or when. I did not know what her normal body temperature was, or whether the shivering I observed in the first hours was clinical hypothermia or simple cold stress. I did not know if she was injured in ways the hair coverage concealed. I did not know how long she had been in the attic before I found her. The storm had peaked around 2 a.m., and I had heard her at 8 a.m., but she might have entered through the gap in the roof damage well before the storm peaked, seeking shelter from the approach conditions. What I knew was what she showed me. She was hungry. This became clear within the first hour through increasingly insistent behavior directed toward my kitchen, toward the smell of food, in ways that required no translation. She followed me into the kitchen with the specific, motivated attention of an animal in need of caloric intake, and she accepted, after some initial wariness, the soft fruits and cooked sweet potato and pieces of hard-boiled egg that I offered on the kitchen floor, where she settled with a preference that I chose not to contest. She was a particular eater, selective in a way that was not random, but systematic, examining each offered food item before accepting or declining it, with a deliberateness that spoke to preferences rather than indiscriminate hunger. She accepted everything plant-based without hesitation. She accepted egg after a longer consideration. She declined the chicken I offered, distinctly and specifically, pushing it aside with a single careful gesture that communicated refusal without aggression. My observations over the days and weeks consistently showed what that initial meal selection prefigured: a dietary framework that was sophisticated, considered, and not the opportunistic omnivory of a generalist species, but the informed selectivity of a being with established knowledge of what was appropriate to eat. She knew what she wanted. She knew, more specifically, what she didn't want. And the knowing was not learned from me during her time in my house. It arrived with her. By the second day, she had established a sleeping area behind the living room couch that I equipped with blankets, and that she reorganized on arrival into a configuration more to her liking, a specific arrangement of nest-like layering that she produced from the blankets with a competence that did not look like experimentation. It looked like habit, like something done many times before in many other sleeping situations with materials, whatever they happened to be. This discovery revealed something profound about her origins that I began, in those first days, to understand. She was not a creature of the deep wilderness. The casual, practiced ease with which she navigated my house, with which she managed stairs and doorways and the geometry of a human domestic space, was not the behavior of an animal encountering a human structure for the first time. It was the behavior of something that had spent time near human structures, that had observed them from proximity, that had a working model of how they were organized and what they contained. She was oriented to the sounds of my house, to the refrigerator cycle, to the water pressure in the pipes, to the specific acoustics of a wood frame structure in weather, in a way that suggested familiarity rather than novelty. This had implications I needed time to fully process. By the end of the first week, I had filled an entire notebook with observations that I want to share partially here, because the observations carry more evidential weight than anything else in this account. Fern showed me, within the first 10 days, a consistent pattern of problem-solving behavior that exceeded anything in my experience of either human children or animals. On day 5, she encountered the child-proof cabinet latch on the kitchen cabinet where I keep the dried fruit she had discovered and strongly preferred. She examined the latch for approximately 4 minutes, not pushing randomly, not getting frustrated and abandoning the attempt, but examining in the focused, methodical way of someone running a diagnostic. She identified the specific mechanical principle of the latch within those 4 minutes and opened the cabinet on the 5th minute cleanly by applying pressure to the correct component in the correct direction. On day 8, she learned to communicate specific requests to me through a combination of gesture and directed attention that we developed jointly. She directing my attention toward a desired object or outcome, and then meeting my eyes with a checking quality that sought confirmation I had understood. This is a form of joint attention, the cognitive capacity to direct another being's attention, to model that being's perspective well enough to understand what they would need to know to satisfy the request and to confirm that the required information has been successfully transmitted. Joint attention develops in human children at approximately 9 months of age. It is considered one of the foundational cognitive capacities underlying language and complex social cognition. Fern displayed it on day 8. By my estimate, she was between 10 and 16 weeks old. Its cries held a secret that these behavioral observations began to articulate into something I could understand. She was not simply more intelligent than a typical mammal. She was intelligent in the specific, socially organized, collaborative, perspective-taking way that human intelligence is organized. Her cognitive architecture was aligned with ours not as a coincidence, but as a feature, as the expression of a species whose social and cognitive evolution had followed a trajectory parallel to ours, producing similar solutions to the similar problems of managing complex social relationships and navigating a world that required more than instinct to survive in. I am a retired school principal. I spent 34 years watching children develop cognitive capacity, and I learned to read it in behavior with the same facility that a physician reads clinical signs. What I was watching in Fern was not animal cognition. It was a variation on the cognitive development I had watched in human children for 3 decades, running faster than human developmental timelines in some dimensions and differently in others, but organizing itself around the same fundamental social and collaborative architecture. She was like a child, not metaphorically, cognitively, functionally, in the specific features of her intelligence that matter most for understanding what a being is and what it is capable of. She was a child of a different species, with a different body and a different relationship to the physical world, but organized at the level of how her mind engaged with problems and with other minds in a way that was recognizably, unmistakably the same kind of thing. Here's why this changed everything in my life. You cannot watch something learn and adapt and request and communicate and comprehend at the level I watched Fern operate and maintain the comfortable distance that conventional thinking about these beings requires. You cannot look at a mind like that and call it legend. The question of how Fern came to be in my attic was one I turned over throughout the weeks of her stay, approaching it from different angles as additional evidence accumulated. The physical evidence was clear. The gap in the roof line at the northeast corner, where the fallen oak's canopy had sheared away the soffit and opened a space large enough for something of Fern's size to pass through. The gap faced the old growth stand along the property's northern boundary, the 100-and-some acres of mixed hardwood and hemlock that had never been cleared, that I had always understood as the wildest part of my immediate environment, the stand that backed up against national forest land that ran unbroken for many miles to the north and west. But the gap alone didn't fully explain Fern's presence. The storm had produced the gap, yes. But something the size of Fern, young, not fully mobile, certainly not capable of the kind of independent navigation that would have brought her from the forest to my roof line without assistance, required either accident or intention to account for. I came to believe it was intention, not Fern's. She was too young for that level of navigation, her mother's. This discovery revealed something profound about the settlement pattern of these beings in relation to human habitation that I had never previously considered. They are not exclusively deep wilderness. The old growth stand along my northern boundary is not true wilderness. It is a fragment of old forest embedded in an agricultural and residential landscape, bounded by roads and property lines, inhabited by a species of being that I now understand lives in closer proximity to human communities than any of the popular accounts of Bigfoot have ever seriously proposed. She had been placed in my attic by someone who knew that my attic was there, who knew that the storm had opened it, and who had made a decision about what to do with a vulnerable infant during a storm that the forest could not adequately shelter. The same decision logic I had seen in the dying Bigfoot mother from other accounts, though this mother, I came to believe, was alive, applied here. A calculation of risks that placed a human structure and a specific human being on the safer side of the ledger. She had been watching this house. She knew its layout, knew I lived alone, knew the roof line's configuration, knew the old-growth stand's proximity to the northeast corner. She had placed her infant where the opening was, with the faith that the person inside would respond to what she found. What most people don't understand is that the forest at the edge of human settlement is not empty. It is occupied, monitored, known by beings who have spent generations in close enough proximity to human communities to understand those communities' rhythms, their structures, their specific human inhabitants, in ways that we have never thought to imagine, because we have never credited these beings with the intelligence such monitoring would require. I had a neighbor I never knew about, living in the old growth stand that I had walked past 10,000 times in 50 years. Watching? I did not immediately know the mother was watching. I began to suspect it on day 4, when my dog, a 7-year-old beagle named Walter, who had spent his entire life on this property and who had a well-established and entirely calm relationship with every species of wildlife in the area, began exhibiting behavior I had not seen from him before. Walter did not bark. This is the detail I want to emphasize, because it is the significant detail. He did not alarm bark, did not display the anxious, territorial response that dogs produce when they are in the presence of something they classify as a threat. He sat at the back door, looking toward the northern tree line with the specific, focused, attentive body language of a dog who is aware of a significant presence nearby and has made a determination that the presence is not a threat, but is something to take seriously nonetheless. He did this on 4 separate occasions over the first week, always in the evening hours, always facing north-northeast. I took to watching the tree line at those times, quietly, without the flashlight or any other signal that I was aware of the observation. I never saw anything. But on the 3rd of those occasions, I have the date in my journal as September 14th, Walter made a sound I had not heard from him before in 7 years. A very low, sustained whine, the specific frequency of vocalization that dogs use for positive social recognition rather than for alarm. He was not alarmed. He was making contact. Something was at the tree line making contact back. I went to the back porch that evening, after dark, alone, with Fern settled for sleep inside, and I stood at the railing and looked north, and I said, as clearly as I could make it, in the direction of the old growth stand, "She's safe. She's eating well. She's safe." The forest said nothing I could hear, but Walter, who had been sitting beside me on the porch, stood up and moved to the screen door and asked, with the specific impatience of a dog whose read on the situation has moved from attending required to attending complete, to go inside. I took that as the communication it probably was. Fern stayed with me for 22 days. In those 22 days, she taught me more about the nature of the world I had been living in for 53 years than I had learned in the preceding half-century, and I want to share the specific lessons because they are the content of the secret her presence revealed. The first lesson was about proximity. These beings are not distant wilderness creatures. They are edge habitat specialists, beings who have learned over however many, generations of living adjacent to human settlement to occupy the spaces where old forest meets human land use, the fragments and corridors and unmaintained borderlands that human mapping often doesn't bother to fully characterize. The old growth stand on my northern boundary is one such space. There are many others like it in Haywood County alone, and in every county in the Appalachian chain, and in the equivalent edge, habitats in every forested region of North America where these beings have been consistently reported. They are not there by accident. They are there deliberately in the specific positioning of beings who understand the value of proximity to human communities and who have developed, across generations, the skills needed to maintain that proximity without detection. The second lesson was about intelligence, watching Fern develop across 22 days, watching the specific cognitive capacities unfold, the problem-solving, the joint attention, the communication development, the rapid and systematic learning. I came to understand that the conventional dismissal of these beings as animals, as subjects of cryptozoological legend rather than objects of moral consideration, is not a position that can survive direct encounter with one of them at the level of intimacy that those 22 days provided. They are not animals in any sense that our existing legal and ethical frameworks use the word. They are persons, of a different species certainly, but persons, beings with minds organized for the same collaborative, social, communicative, perspective-taking intelligence that we have decided, as a civilization, grounds moral consideration and legal protection. The implications of this realization for how we relate to the landscapes these beings inhabit are ones I have spent 6 years working through, and I am not finished. The third lesson was about the storm, not the meteorological event, but what the storm represented in the larger pattern of what I now understand about the relationship between these beings and their environment. Florence had been an unusually destructive storm for the Western Carolina mountains. Not the most severe on record, but severe enough to displace wildlife across the region, to move animals from their ordinary habitats into unusual refuges, to create, across a broad landscape, a crisis of shelter and safety. The storm had produced the gap in my roofline, but it had also produced for Fern's mother a set of conditions under which the careful generational management of distance from human settlement was, for a brief period, less important than her infant survival. The storm had made contact necessary, and when it was necessary, the capacity for that contact was there, because it had always been there, maintained in reserve, available for exactly the circumstances that made it the only viable choice. I knew the return was coming the way I had known the mother was watching, not through specific legible signals, but through the accumulation of small behavioral changes in Fern that told me she was orienting toward something I could not see. Beginning on day 18, she began spending more time at the back windows, facing north. Not with the watchful alertness I had come to associate with her general environmental monitoring, with a quality of attention that was different, more personal, more directed. She was listening for something specific, the way you listen for a car in the driveway when you are expecting someone home. On day 21, she was restless in a way that had no other explanation. Not hungry, not sick, not uncomfortable, but unable to settle, moving from room to room with a frequency and a purposefulness that was unlike her ordinary exploratory behavior. Walter tracked her movements from his bed with the patient attention of an old dog who has learned to read the room. On the morning of September 29th, I opened the back door for Walter's morning walk, as I always did, and Fern moved through the door with him. I do not mean she bolted. I do not mean she escaped or seized an opportunity. She walked through the open door with the measured, deliberate calm of someone who has made a decision and is executing it cleanly, and she crossed the backyard and reached the edge of the garden, and then she paused and turned and looked at me, standing in the open doorway. Here's why this changed everything in my life. Not the previous 22 days, not the care and the connection and the education I had received across those 3 weeks, but this single moment. She looked at me the way that children look at the adults who have cared for them when they are about to go somewhere the adult cannot follow, not asking permission, confirming that the person they are leaving understands that the leaving is okay, that what happened between them was complete in itself, that the going doesn't erase what was. I said, "Go on then. Go home." She turned north and walked into the old-growth stand at the property boundary, and the forest, as I have heard described by others who have witnessed this, simply received her and closed around her and resumed its morning quality as if she had always been part of it, which I now understood she had. I still live in this house. I still keep bees and grow vegetables and walk the trails in the Pisgah forest that I have been walking all my life. The red oak that fell in Florence is gone. I had it milled in the spring of 2019, and some of it is now part of a bookcase in my living room, and some of it I gave to a neighbor who makes furniture. The gap in my roofline has been repaired. The attic is the attic again, full of family history and cedar smell and 50 years of accumulated life. And everything is different. I cannot walk the property's northern boundary without knowing what I now know lives in proximity to it. I cannot look at the old-growth stand without understanding it differently than I did before September 6th, 2018. I cannot read a County Planning Commission agenda item about land use on the forest's edge without feeling the specific weight of what is at stake in those decisions, a weight I did not feel before and that I cannot set down. What most people don't understand is that the secret Fern's presence revealed was not a secret about Bigfoot in the sense of they exist, and this is what they look like, and this is where you can find them. The secret was more personal than that, more specific, more intimate in its demand. The secret was, we have neighbors we don't know about, and we have been making decisions that affect their lives without knowing they exist, and the not knowing has not protected them from the consequences of our choices. The old-growth stand on my northern boundary is privately owned. I do not own it. I cannot protect it from development decisions made by people who do not know what lives in it. I have tried since 2018, through the limited mechanisms available to a private citizen in Haywood County, North Carolina, to ensure that the stand's ecological value is recognized in the county's land use planning process. I have been partially successful. The stand is still intact, for now. I walk its edge sometimes in the evenings, at the hour when the light goes amber in the maples and the air carries the particular smell of leaf mold and creek water that I have known all my life. I do not call out. I do not announce my presence. I simply walk, and I pay the specific kind of attention that those 22 days taught me to pay. The full-body, whole-environment attention of someone who understands that the forest is inhabited, and that its inhabitants are aware of her as surely as she is aware of them. I do not see anything. I have not seen anything in 6 years. But sometimes Walter, walking beside me, does his thing, that focused, non-alarmed attention toward the interior of the stand, the low positive vocalization, and I know that the attention is not unobserved, that the quiet watching and the quiet being watched is its own kind of communication, its own kind of relationship. It is enough. It has to be. I am telling this story now 6 years after the fact for a specific reason that I want to be direct about. Haywood County is growing. The land pressures on the edge habitats, the old growth fragments, the unmaintained timber stands, the overlooked corners of the county that the planning maps describe as low-value land are intensifying. People are moving to the mountains for the scenery and the quality of life in the space, and the space is being used, and the things that lived in the space are being displaced into smaller and more marginal territories with fewer options for the kind of crisis management that Fern's mother exercised on the night of September 6th, 2018. The storm opened a gap in my roof. Her mother used that gap because it was available in a landscape with less edge habitat, fewer intact old-growth fragments, more human-occupied territory, and less unoccupied territory for beings who need the edge to function. The options available to a mother trying to protect her infant in a crisis would be fewer. The margin would be narrower. The outcome for Fern, for her mother, for however many others share that old-growth stand and the network of edge habitat connected to it, would be less certain. I cannot tell you exactly what to do with this. I am a retired school principal in a small county in the Western Carolina mountains, and the levers of land use policy and conservation funding and zoning regulation are not primarily in my hands. What I can tell you is what the 22 days taught me, and what I believe the telling of it is for. Pay attention to the edges, the margins of the forest, the fragments of old growth, the unmaintained corners of the map that human planning tends to skip past as not worth the time. These are not empty. They are inhabited by beings whose existence we have been unable to take seriously because our frameworks for deciding what exists have not included them. The inability to take something seriously is not evidence that it doesn't exist. It is evidence of the limits of our frameworks. Expand the category. When you make decisions about land, at the ballot box, at the planning commission meeting, in the purchase of property and the choices of what to do with it, expand the category of beings whose interests you allow to be part of the calculation. Not just the species that federal lists protect, not just the charismatic fauna that conservation fundraising photographs, the beings in the gaps, the ones in the old-growth fragments and the edge habitats and the storm-damaged corners of farmhouses who do not have the institutional representation required to speak for themselves in the processes that govern their habitat. Remember Fern. I remember her every day, the specific weight of a small hand in mine, on an attic floor in the quiet after a storm. The cabinet latch she figured out in 4 minutes. The way she reorganized the blankets behind the couch into the specific configuration of a known and practiced comfort. The look she gave me from the garden edge before she walked into the trees, the look that said everything we had been to each other and released both of us from the terms of it, cleanly and completely, and without regret. This discovery revealed something profound that I want to leave you with as the final and most essential thing I know from those 22 days. The extraordinary is not elsewhere. It is not in the deep wilderness beyond the reach of ordinary people. It is at the edge of ordinary life, in the old growth stand at the back of a farmhouse 5 acres from the national forest boundary, in the gap that a storm opens in a roof line on a September night. It is close. It has always been close, and what it requires from us is not expedition or equipment or expertise. It requires attention and the willingness. When something small and cold and frightened makes itself known to you in the quiet after the storm, to climb the stairs.